Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we're taking a look at Infinity N5 and specifically Toolbox Units. This is a guide on how to use Toolbox Units, what units you should take, and how to make that determination about what Toolbox Units might be right for you and your list. So first off, what is a Toolbox Unit? Toolbox Units are units with multiple capabilities. That means they're not just limited to one role in your list. Very often a unit might be compressed to, they do visibility control, they're a face-to-face shooter, they're a close combat specialist, that kind of thing. A toolbox unit won't be compressed to just one role. They're going to have multiple capabilities. They're going to have quite specialized roles, skills, and or equipment. So your toolbox units won't usually be equipped with run-of-the-mill utility items. They may be equipped with hacking devices, specialized equipment like fast pandas, and skills like engineer. They're an opportunity to compress your list slots. They add redundancy or increase order efficiency. Infinity N5 is very big on making very good use out of your list slots. So if you have a toolbox unit that can combine two elements of individual units you already have, it can be a decent consideration to free up a slot to be able to bring an extra unit into your list you wouldn't otherwise be able to. They also add redundancy. A lot of the time you can see toolbox units be backup hackers in case your main hacker goes down. And they also increase order efficiency. If you can strap some kind of specialist skill to, say, a gunfighter, their movements up the field taking gunfights and pressing buttons can save you a lot of orders as they get there. However, they are generally more expensive, as they're paying for these capabilities, equipment, and skills. So what makes a good toolbox unit? Meeting the standard of competency in its capabilities as a toolbox unit is the major point. So what do I mean by standard of competency? We're going to talk about it a bit more later, but the things it's aiming to do, does it do those to a certain standard? Do they provide tools relevant to the faction, mission, or list? You can be taking lots of toolbox units, and there are factions that do toolbox units more or better than other factions, but you have to check yourself. Are these varied skills I'm taking, are they something that my list, or the mission, or the faction is calling out for? You also have to be careful that you don't overpay or buy bloated models where it becomes a burden on the list. As I said before, these toolbox units are generally more expensive, and if you pick up too many or you pick up the wrong units, you can quickly find yourself out of points. Finally, can it succeed in the role that its equipment requires of it? An equipment like, say, a sensor is a very good piece of kit, but is only really useful if it's on a gunfighting unit trying to do long-range discovers, or if it's on a unit that wants to move up the field. A unit that sort of just wants to sit inside a deployment zone, not really stick its head up, it's not going to be able to make good use of that sensor. So the tools that it has, is it actually going to be in a position to use them? Alright, now let's talk about standard of competency. A standard of competency is the minimum bar that a unit needs to meet in order to be able to use part of its toolkit. Different factions have different standards, or have different ways of meeting standards, but there is generally an accepted bar across factions for what makes a unit competent in its role. An example of this might be in shooting. This was sort of becoming a bit less true in N4, but now back in N5, BS13, or being BS12 with mods such as Mimetism or Visor, is now where we see the standard benchmark of shooting being. If you aren't at least BS13 or BS12 with mods, you're probably below average at shooting. We can see this in substandard, where if you're less than BS12 or BS12 with no mods, you're probably not going to be excelling in the role of a gunfighter. You also have an above average, where if you're over BS13 or you're over BS13 with mods, you're doing quite well for yourself and are quite competent in your role. Here in hacking, we get to see some of that faction context come into play. We can see that the standard for hacking in Pan-Oceania is a Whip 12 with your Fusilier hackers and some other specialists. This is contrasted greatly by the Haq Islam Whip 14, which is standard among their line troops. Substandard hacking doesn't necessarily exist in Pan-Oceania because that 12 is really your floor. You can't go lower than that, just period. However, in Haq Islam, if you're going below Whip 14, you're usually picking someone quite substandard. An above standard whip for Pan-Oceania looks like something like Whip 13, or maybe if you're really on your top shelf, Whip 13 with surprise attack from something like a Zulu Cobra. But then in Haq Islam, you've got units with Whip 15 or 14 who are able to put surprise attack modifiers on top of that and really reach a high benchmark with their hacking. Now, while Haq Islam clearly has an advantage in this hacking game, if we were to go back to the previous slide and do a factional example, we'd see that the Pan-Oceanian standard for shooting is much higher than the Haq Islamite standard for shooting. Let's say we had a Haq Islam toolbox unit who was BS-12 with mimetism -3 and say a Spitfire, and was also a killer hacker with Whip 14. That would be a very good toolbox unit, as both of those skills it brings to the table meet that standard of competency. So the first step when you're taking a toolbox unit is to figure out, does it meet the standard of competency in all the areas it wants to exist in, as well as what is my faction's standard of competency for its bringing to the table. There are context considerations when you're looking at toolbox units as well. How does the unit fit into links is a very big one. There are some toolbox units that are really great because of how they can link and how they can provide synergy. But there's also toolbox units that are a bit awkward to fit in a link. Maybe they're better on their own, but then if they're on their own, they're not bringing in efficiency that a fire team could. Could I build a fire team to have that toolbox nature without the specific unit? There's lots of questions you can ask here. Does the unit's equipment want it to be in a particular position? This is another one. A lot of times you can get units stuck in your deployment zone who really want to be using equipment further up the table, and a little more rarely vice versa, where a unit starting in the midfield really wants to use a piece of kit from the back of the board. An example of this might be a infiltrating hidden deployment multi-sniper, where a new player might be tempted to use that infiltration to chuck it far up the table, when really the best vantage might be somewhere in your deployment zone. Do I need this tool? Is another big one. You can often find yourself overdosing on specific tools or not taking enough around those tools to make it worthwhile. An example of this might be overdosing on engineers if you're not running enough remotes. I love evaders as much as the next guy, but if you're not taking many remotes that tool supports, it might not be a tool worth taking. And how much am I paying for these tools is the big question you have to be paying attention to as the points in your list start to rack up. So, this being said, let's do a competency check between two units in the Nomads faction. On the left we have the Evader, who I would consider quite a good toolbox unit, and we'll be specifically looking at the Evader AP Spitfire Engineer profile. Looking at his AP Spitfire, and keeping in mind, guns are a tool, an AP Spitfire is a very good tool. AP, burst 4 in a fantastic range band, but is the Evader competent enough to use that tool? BS-13, that hits our standard of competency, especially in Nomads, that's absolutely fine, so we're getting a tick there. A Whip 13 Engineer, fantastic, he's getting a tick there. He brings a Timbot -3, which, while somewhat useful on his own, he can link with other hackers, such as a Jazz or a Valyria, who would really benefit from that firewall. So he gets a tick for bringing that Timbot, which is a great tool. Finally, with a Deactivator, the Evader is a piece that wants to move up the board and is going to be in a likely position to use that Deactivator, whereas something like a deployment zone like a clockmaker, might not necessarily be in that position. Here we can see a nice list of tools that the evader's got, and he's reached the standard of competency for all the tools he's bringing. This is a really good sign that you're bringing a very good toolbox unit. On the other side, we have Elena Kovac, who also has a variety of skills and tools she brings to the table. The first one she has is an X-Visor, which is ultimately a shooting tool that lets you project your threat range a little bit longer at a substantial, well, not quite a benefit, as it detracts from your ballistic skill. Looking at her ballistic skill of 12, this is below the standard of competency that we'd expect for shooting skills. So I'm not quite happy with that, and I'd be giving her an X on that one. Next up, triangulated fire is in a similar position. If I'm going to be using triangulated fire, I want it to be on a unit that reaches the standard of competency on shooting, so she's not getting past that one either. The sensor is an interesting one. Elena can be run in a variety of links, but whether she ends up moving forward or back is sort of at the mercy of what else is around her. So the sensor is quite a good piece of kit, but I'm not convinced that she'll be able to use it all the time. And this is similar with her tactical awareness, where Tunguska has very competitive links, one Harris, one Core, and Elena you can't build a duo off, or a Harris or a Core off of Elena, meaning those slots from 3 to 5 in your Harris and Core teams are quite competitive. So the tactical awareness, it's good, but like the sensor, in her context and in what's around her, and with what she wants to do, I'm not sure if you can get maximum value out of it. However, she does bring Spec Op to the table, and is Whip 14, which is really good. Tunguska isn't necessarily a faction that needs that Whip 14 or is lacking high whip button pressers, but this is a case where she's getting a tick. Now, while Elena has received fairly mixed to poor marks here, this doesn't mean that she's a bad unit. It just means that it's something to consider when you're making your list, whether or not you should be taking her, and if she's really worth all her points in whatever the final iteration of your list is looking like. Now onto a unit that I think is absolutely terrible, unlike Elena. We have the Wildcat Engineer. And one of its big problems is it has a lot of skills on the table that pull it in very different directions. The Wildcat Engineer is a 25-point engineer in a faction that has quite good engineers, being Corregidor, and quite good toolbox engineers. On the gunfighter side of things, it's got BS-13, which is on that standard, and MSV-1, which is quite a good skill. However, it only has a combi rifle and a light flamethrower. This means that you're losing a lot of the benefit of that multispectral visor, and potentially, depending on how you look at it, even that BS-13. In the role of an engineer, it's Whip 13, which is quite good. It's on the standard. But Combat Instinct and Number 2 are skills you're not necessarily using when you're in that engineer role. And the hard part is, even though we've separated these two categories of gunfighter and engineer, both sides are having to pay the points for the other side. This leads to a highly bloated model that you're paying a lot of points for a unit that wants to do two very different things and can't maximize itself in a way you'd really want it to. 25 points, low synergy, fire teams built around the Wildcat Engineer aren't going to be doing an incredible amount, or could excel more if it was a different unit. And lastly, there are just much better options. This is a time when I'd look at a toolbox unit and just say no. Let's compare this to DeFersen in military orders, however. As while 25 points doesn't sound like a lot, it's a decent pull, but now we're looking at a very expensive toolbox unit. 46 points and 1.5 SWIC is taking up a significant amount of your list's resources. Here we can see two distinct roles. We've got Gunfighter and Hacker. For the Gunfighter, he's BS-14, with a Spitfire, which is fantastic. That's above the standard of competency. He's got 2 wounds and 4 armor, which means he's quite survivable in his role in gunfighting. Additionally, he is a Whip 14 hacker with a Trinity upgrade and BTS 6, which is a fantastic suite of hacking abilities. While both sides of the coin are paying for the other half, the standard of competency with DeFersen in both of these areas is so high that you don't really mind paying those points. If we go back to the previous slide, we can see that if you're taking the Wildcat Engineer for its engineering qualities, you're losing all those points nested in its gunfighting qualities. Where DeFersen is such a good gunfighter and such a good hacker, you will likely be using both of those capabilities. Additionally, there's some stuff that helps either end. The 2 wounds from the gunfighting side makes his hacking ability a lot stronger in that he won't be knocked over by a single Trinity. His hacking abilities also complement his gunfighting role fantastically, where he can ward off attacks from a hacking basis with those skills. While he is a very high points cost, and some could say bloated by close combat skills, I think they're fine. He's very high synergy in the roles he's in. He can wildcard in most places, be complemented by a Timbot, complement some kind of strike force, and is also the best-in-class front military orders has regarding a hacker. While DeFersen is very expensive, I think he scores quite a bit higher than the Wildcat, who, while not as expensive as DeFersen, still commands a decent price tag. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this video was able to help. We've got some more faction focuses and other great videos coming soon, so stay tuned. Thank you. Bye-bye.